All right, there you go, Jason. Take her away.
All right, thank you, Patrick. Well, hello, everyone. Very happy to be here and happy to see some familiar and new faces as well. I'm especially happy to see that we have some guests from NSF here. Hello, Amy. Hello, Kevin. And I'm glad that they're here because travel for this conference that we did was generously supported by NSF. We were very happy to get a travel grant to help make this conference such a success last year. And I'm also pleased to see my colleague Andrew Ruther, who's here. He actually is the kind of co-coordinator with me of the RCSI event, and so I'm glad that he's here to be part of the discussion that might emerge out of this. So. For those of you who attended or were otherwise a part of the fall CASC meeting, I did give a version along with Andrew of this talk at that event, but this has some changes that you will see. And in particular, as you'll see, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a lot of the themes that emerged out of the RCSI event from the attendees. And many of them are concerns or challenges or problems. And the question that always comes up, rightly so, after we sort of list all these challenges or problems or whatever is, well, what can we do about it? Right? And sometimes those questions are harder to answer for some of those challenges than others. But what I did is I sat down and, Andrew and I kind of reflected on that and we said, it's very valid to say that. And it's not as productive, we think, to just list off a bunch of problems without thinking of at least some ways to address some of those issues. And so I do have a few slides with some things that I've spoken with a few people about. And I'm certainly open for any feedback from this community here today as to other avenues that we might take. So without further ado, I will get into this and I will try to make it as efficient as possible because what I'd really like to do is to see some discussion emerge around this. All right. Okay, I'm presuming everybody can see this. All right, we move the proverbial controls out of the way a little bit. All right, there we go. Okay. So the first Research Computing for Smaller Institutions conference was held last year. This actually grew out of kind of three prior smaller events that we had run in years past with just one gap for the primary COVID year. And these prior events were really focused on high performance computing at liberal arts institutions. But at the last of those events, as we were sort of talking about what we might want to do next year or how we might want to grow the event, attendees proposed, well, what if we widened the scope a little bit? What if we step out of just considering research computing broadly considered, um, and really kind of think about that in a more holistic way? And also, instead of just being focused on liberal arts attendees, why don't we target smaller institutions in general? And what we mean by smaller institutions is basically non-R1. It doesn't mean that there aren't useful takeaways maybe for R1s, but in terms of content and kind of how we want to really focus things, we thought, well, let's just kind of stick to the non-R1 audience. And so then we got together and we said, well, this is really a fundamental redesign of kind of what we have. So let's sort of package it together in a new box and tie it together with a new bow and make it look all shiny. And that's where the genesis for the Research Computing for Smaller Institutions conference came from. And it's predicated on a few guiding principles. One of the primary things that we recognize is that smaller schools confront, increasingly so, similar research computing technical challenges that the larger institutions do. We're all aware of what these are. These are, things related to data management challenges, reproducible workflows. How do we collaborate both intramurally and extramurally? How do we manage complex user environments that have specific requirements for software stacks? All of these kinds of things. Just because we're a smaller institution doesn't mean that we don't, have those kinds of challenges as well. And as a smaller institution, we have to face those exact same challenges without the resource levels that many larger institutions have. And when I talk about resource levels, I'm talking about not just money, but that certainly is one, but also just time, the amount of FTEs that we tend to have availability, the breadth of expertise and just experience that our staff tend to have, our ability to deploy infrastructure, whether that's due to physical space or other aspects of infrastructure that we'll talk about later. So we've got to address those same problems. We just have often fewer resources to do so. And also, we believe that an open discussion of these challenges that smaller institutions tend to face can foster new and beneficial ideas, opportunities, open up collaborative opportunities, and so on and so forth. So those were really the principles that we put in place as we were crafting kind of what our vision for this event would be. We also recognize that there has been substantial progress towards democratizing access to resources, beyond R1 kind of class institutions. But we still believe that a lot of work remains, and this work remains in terms of communication, in terms of, facilitation, all of these kinds of things. And so we wanted this event, and we want this event moving forward to help to make positive inroads, into that kind of progress that we'd like to see. And also, and I think that this is fairly obvious to most people, a lot of conferences that focus on research computing, they tend to skew large in terms of the scale of represented institutions, in terms of the research support needs that the attendees have and the capabilities that the institutions themselves had, as well as the proposed solutions. A lot of them are just designed or kind of meant for those, heavy research intensive institutions. And therefore, there are fewer actionable pathways that are available for smaller institutions. And so we wanted to propose actionable pathways and ways in which smaller institutions can begin to address some of these challenges. In terms of attendance at our inaugural event, we had 83 registrants representing 62 unique institutions and organizations. The Carnegie classifications are here. You can see that, certainly the focus was exactly where we wanted it to be, which are baccalaureate colleges, arts and science focused, along with a smattering of, masters and stuff like that. We did have a fair number of R1s come, which was great, and they absolutely contributed, wonderful things to the event. But I was glad to see that certainly the large majority were not from R1s, which is exactly what we wanted. And then we had, attendees from a variety of organizations: NSF, CARC, I2, ERN, OSG, CASC, all of that kind of stuff. They were there as well, and many of them did present. Here's kind of a map showing also some additional classifications that were self-reported or that we identified as well. And here is the agenda, just to take a look at. This QR code, if you care, will take you to our website, which now has information for this year. But you can look at this agenda, and I'm very proud of this agenda. And I think, Andrew and I spent a lot of time working on this. We think that there's a lot of great stuff in here, which is a good mix of kind of national providers, larger institutions offering resources that are very useful and helpful for smaller institutions, as well as the smaller institutions themselves kind of presenting exactly what's going on with them and kind of putting themselves out there. So we thought that this was a great agenda. So what were some of the themes that kind of came out of this? Well, I would say one of the primary ones that was just reinforced over and over again is this recognition of the importance of local facilitation. Comprehensive local facilitation, having folks on the ground, is absolutely crucial to the success of any research computing ecosystem. And if you don't have that, if you're missing that key component, Even if you have access to resources, it doesn't matter whether they are local or whether they're regional or whatever it is. A lot of those initiatives, unfortunately, are apt to fail, or at least they will never reach their full potential. In some ways, as I've talked with a lot of people, it seems that getting resources is actually the easy part of the equation. It's not that challenging in most circumstances to find some CI equipment or other resources to kind of do what you need to do. But if you're missing that local facilitation part, particularly at a smaller institution, they're probably not going to be leveraged in the most efficient or effective way, and it can lead to people giving up and just not really moving forward with whatever the project is that they're trying to do. And that's kind of what I say here. Like I've talked to a number of institutions, both small and large, where, the experience does bear this out. Access is the easy part. But if there's not an embedded facilitator that kind of understands that local culture, local support frameworks, the expectations there, they may unfortunately fail. And this was something that we heard from so many of our attendees in various forms, but it really does often kind of come back to this. And this is really exacerbated by the realities of this scale. So, for instance, one interesting thing is that there's often no course release available for research, even with grants. So, at a lot of smaller institutions, it is not possible for the faculty to buy themselves out of their teaching requirements, which is something, of course, that's done all the time at larger institutions. And in fact, it's kind of expected at larger institutions many times. And so, because of that, because they're still trying to do research at the same time that they're having their full teaching load, their full advising load, research becomes something that is integrated much more holistically at this scale with the pedagogical approach that the researchers are taking. So they literally become part of the teaching mission as well. They need that extra guidance and support. Research is not something that can become a primary consumer of their time. So they have to find creative ways to integrate it within the other activities that they do. And that really puts a heavier burden on need for local facilitation, which so often is missing at schools of this scale. This, of course, is related to a lack of FTEs. One of the most common manifestations of being under-resourced is insufficient FTE. Many schools that are not R1, certainly when you get down to the, baccalaureate only, the liberal arts institutions, they're lucky if they have one FTE that's kind of devoted to research computing or high performance computing. A lot of times it's a zero point 0.5 FTE. It's a part of somebody's responsibility, but it's very rare to find one or two FTE. Certainly more becomes incredibly uncommon at smaller institutions. And this results in a lack of broad expertise to support a wide panoply of workflows. When you're only dealing with a fraction of somebody's time or one FTE, it's really not possible to be able to have the expertise and experience needed to readily support all of the problems and workflows and teaching needs at this scale at the institutions. And in particular, we see this manifest where smaller institutions often struggle to support very specific disciplines and their software. So at larger institutions, it's really common to have, research software experts or, other people who have disciplinary specific expertise who are embedded there and can really work with the graduate students, with the faculty, with the students, whoever it is, to kind of help support those workflows. But at smaller institutions, we cannot possibly be expert in all of the software stacks, all of the pipelines, these kinds of things to provide anything other than best effort support. And that really does, in some cases, limit what is possible. And so, yeah, I mean, in some cases, we do have researchers come to us and say, well, what I'd really love to be able to do is this, or when I was a graduate student, I worked with my, advisor on this piece of software, and I'd really like to get it up and running. But if we don't have that experience locally, if we don't have that expertise, we may find ourselves struggling mightily to, enable that for a researcher. And sometimes it's just that we have to say we just simply don't have the infrastructure, or we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the expertise, we don't have the time that we can devote to this. Infrastructure nightmares. This is another very common refrain. These are very real and they're very much increasing. And generally speaking, these are related to the big three: the power, the cooling, and the space requirements. Um, and in many cases, what this means is that there's no good solution to support on-prem growth. And this is exacerbated by the rise in AI ML workflows. We need more power to, run these chips. They're going to generate more heat. We need more nodes. We need just more of things which require more space. And at smaller institutions, we often do not have the physical space or the infrastructure or the team, the staff that's kind of needed to run these. We don't have the budgets to pay for, upgrading data centers or to deal with the power bills. It's always interesting to me when I go to certain events and, larger institutions are saying, oh, yeah, we're, talking with our local power company and they're going to literally build a substation on our campus. And it's like, well, that's just not something that, we're going to be able to do at smaller institutions. And so what is happening is it's literally becoming impossible to support sufficient on-prem capacity to make meaningful, efficient scientific contributions. We're often able to, play in the sandbox a little bit to kind of get our hands dirty to a certain extent. But when it really comes to being able to do sustained progress, towards science, that is, smaller institutions are increasingly, with what they have available on-prem, becoming unable to do that. Um, and also as a result of that, some institutions are facing a potential end of centralized HPC support. We have talked with some of our peer institutions where essentially the administration is saying, look, it's becoming too expensive to, pay for, hosting of this stuff, or we are running out of room in our centralized, co-location facility. And so we're having to distribute it back out to the departments or back out to the research labs. And that really becomes a challenge for support for sure. Dedicated hosting costs at, like, a lot of the facilities, the data centers are just becoming rapidly out of the reach for smaller institutions. Some people say, well, why not go to the cloud? And sure, there are absolutely workloads and workflows where that is extremely appropriate. But when you really look at kind of sustained use of cloud resources, most economic analyses say that it's about 4 to 8x more expensive than running that same workflow on-prem. And there's a lot of disagreement about that. There's a lot of factors and variables that go into that. But the general rule of thumb that I think most of our peers talk about is that when they really look at the numbers, it still is much more expensive to run something in at least the commercial cloud than it is to do it on-prem. And as I kind of intimated, there are often lack of budgets to build or renovate on-prem facilities. I'm talking with a lot of peer schools now who are seeing this exactly happen. They just don't have a lot of options to go beyond what they currently have. So what about collaborations? Well, regional or other collaborative solutions have often been and can still be a good fit for smaller institutions. But having locally supported, fully controlled on-prem resources is often really important for these institutions. And that's because it becomes a differentiating factor that they can use in order to set themselves apart from their peers. So it raises the prestige of the institution. It raises the prestige when they're able to manage research and teaching workflows that can leverage these kinds of facilities locally. It's also a very real and very visible and exciting item to have for alumni and donors. They get excited about this. They like the blinking lights that are happening in the data center, right? It becomes something very real that they can point to and kind of use to attract funding and again to just differentiate themselves from their peer institutions. And it can become an incredibly important recruiting tool for faculty and students. I'm happy to give some more examples of this if there's time later. But absolutely smaller institutions, including ones that I have been intimately involved with, have lost out on being able to recruit the best and brightest faculty and in some cases research active students because we simply do not have the on-prem ability to support their needs. And that really is not what deans of faculty and provosts and presidents kind of want to run into at all. And so essentially, right, infrastructure and the ability to support very specific kinds and scales of research locally can actually become a really important part of the brand that a school has. So, one of the institutions that I worked with, for instance, said that they wanted to be a STEM-focused liberal arts institution, and they needed to make sure that they had the research infrastructure to kind of back up that claim. And so that was important to them. And what we see is that it becomes incredibly rare for a small institution that can effectively support a mix of local, regional, or national and cloud resources. Given the limited FTE, given the limited expertise and experience of a smaller staff, it becomes often a pick one scenario. You might have great experience doing stuff on-prem, but you have less experience running workflows in the cloud. You might not have a lot of experience, integrating access resources into your teaching workflows. Whatever it might be, we do often see that smaller institutions, especially, kind of are in the pick one category here. There are increasing research expectations at smaller institutions as well. So, we talk to faculty who are coming in. Maybe they're coming out of R1 institutions and they have an expectation to be able to carry on their research paradigms wherever they end up, including smaller institutions. And historically, smaller institutions were more focused on teaching. But what we are seeing is that many of them within their kind of vision statements or their campus plans or whatever, they are focusing more on research even at smaller institutional scales. Yeah, this is kind of what I just said, that we are seeing over and over faculty coming in from R1 grad programs, and they may have data needs, they may have collaboration needs that are unique, that, have not been seen at smaller institutions, and now all of a sudden we're scrambling to try to support them in effective ways. And that can be very problematic and challenging. And again, as I've said, I have seen myself, I have been a part of these conversations where if we are unable to support these more intensive research programs, or if we're unable to handle the data needs that they might have with, PII or other, classified data or just whatever it may be, HIPAA stuff, doesn't matter. These candidates may have to go elsewhere, and that means that the smaller institutions are potentially losing out. And this goes back to what I said earlier. This is just kind of a refrain that they can't buy themselves out with teaching grants, and they do not have graduate students, so they often rely on undergraduates for research support, or maybe they have them for a limited time for, say, a summer research program or something like that, but they don't have the same kind of sustained student engagement and expertise that folks from larger institutions have, and that likewise hurts them. The dreaded fifth co-PI, yeah. So we do see larger institutions often expressing interest in, and they do seek out smaller institutions to participate in funding initiatives, regional collaborations, these kinds of things. But What we do hear time and again is that these efforts are not always in the best interest of smaller institutions. The larger institutions will sometimes, unfortunately, use them as that fifth co-PI, or they will inadequately account for their needs and goals. They won't really make it a primary part of the proposal that they're putting together or the funding ask. And they often have done this historically to appear diverse and inclusive. And this is not to say that all larger institutions do this. There have been absolutely wonderful and effective collaborations with institutions of all size, but we do hear from smaller institutions that this has been a thing and that this is a real concern. And so there is substantial interest on their part in taking the lead on funding requests. This was very evident from this first conference that we had with people saying, I absolutely want to be able to apply for a CC star or for an MRI or for something like that. However, I don't have sufficient resources locally, whether it's, my own personal time, whether it's the FTE that we have, to kind of put that together. Like, I need good guidance. I need to understand, how to put together like a campus CI plan. I need to understand how to pull my faculty to find science drivers. I need models for, kind of data sharing plans or data management plans. I need templates. I need really true practical advice that can scale down a little bit if I am indeed interested to do this. And this is currently lacking. Well, why does this matter? Okay, so why does all of this matter? Well, quite frankly, 80% of all undergraduate students in the United States are at non-R1 institutions. So this means that the smaller institutions become a substantial nexus of pedagogical and research innovation. The one strength that smaller institutions do often display is that they're nimble. They are creative in very critical ways. They're able to pivot quite quickly when it comes to, curricular innovation, vocational experiences that they're able to provide to students, industry partnerships that they can have, research priorities. When you're at an R1, often it's kind of like the Titanic. It's kind of hard to shift direction very quickly, but smaller institutions often can. There's less red tape, and this can be a real advantage to this. And so one of the things that we really came out of this with is to say that, look, if the U.S. wants to enhance its competitiveness, groups of all kind, whether it's CAS, CARC, NSF, these kind of things, they have to engage, support, and leverage this constituency, this smaller sort of scale, in very sustained first order ways. This was something that our attendees kept emphasizing quite a bit. Well, what can larger institutions do? So here's the new part to all of this, where we said, well, okay, how can larger institutions kind of help this? Well, they could reach out to smaller institutions in their area and really try to get an understanding of what the challenges are. However, this is difficult because when you phrase things that way, you may not be likely to get much useful information. And that is because researchers at smaller institutions, especially, are very used to working within the constraints that are available. Like they have a certain amount of on-prem resources, or they have a certain number of workflows that they know work that those institutions are able to support. And so instead of trying to push against those walls and sort of push those boundaries, they craft research agendas that kind of fit more nicely within those constraints. So it's often very helpful to be able to talk with them about what they would like to be able to do with little thought given to whatever your current realities are. And so those kind of conversations may be able to identify some concrete ways to work with them. And this would be the proverbial low-hanging fruit. It could just be access to resources. It could just be, check-ins. It could just be any sort of, bringing to bear experience that the R1s have that they know ways to solve in ways that are applicable at the scales of smaller institutions, and then actually helping them implement those. Now, granted, this does rely a lot on the largesse of the smaller institutions. I'm not oblivious to that reality. But there can be seeds there for collaborative opportunities or for regional opportunities that could then play well with subsequent funding requests and similar items. Research computing staff at a larger institution can take a day, for instance, can go and visit the campus, see what they might be able to do locally, because they might be able to make some really good suggestions in terms of networking configurations, other sort of physical space kinds of things, workflows. And often they would really appreciate an in-person visit. It would also be great for larger institutions to host training sessions for skills that would be particularly useful to the scales of those institutions. So again, if they're able to visit and kind of do that locally, that would be awesome. This sort of notion of leveling up researchers and staff to use what they currently have more effectively could be a very easy win here. We would love to see more internships or similar kinds of things for students or even staff from smaller institutions to develop these skill sets that they otherwise could not locally. So if we're trying to get away from that pick one mentality of either cloud or on-prem or, national resources or regional collaborations or whatever it is, let's find opportunities to sort of skill build in very effective and creative ways in partnership with larger institutions. We've heard a lot of requests for credit-bearing courses. So often smaller institutions don't have sufficient faculty to teach all of the courses that would give vocational skills or the skills that the students really want to have, who are thinking about going into fields related to this or going on to graduate programs as well. So if a small institution, for instance, can't teach a parallel programming class or something like that, it would be wonderful to have those available from larger institutions where there are reciprocal agreements or something like that. We know that this is very challenging to do, but we have heard requests for these kind of things. It would also just be very helpful to reach out to smaller institutions and say, hey, look, we see that there's a CC Star solicitation that's coming up, or there's this MRI opportunity that's in 6 months or whatever. We think it would be a good fit for you, or we think it would be a good collaborative opportunity for us, but let's really work together with you from the ground up to help you to create the proposal or to strengthen a proposal that we can do together. We can help you create a campus CI plan. We can, help you plan sort of the trajectory where you're going and work together on this. And also, and this was something which was a very interesting kind of discussion, is larger institutions are often very intimately integrated with whoever their state REN is, generally speaking. And it is similarly interesting how many smaller institutions don't even know what a REN is. They don't know what they're for. They don't know who their state REN is or how to contact them. They don't know ways in which these RENs can assist with or can partner on projects or can help with funding proposals, letters of collaboration, these sort of things. And so this is one way that we think an R1 or just a larger institution who is more familiar with those processes can help to make those introductions, can help to smooth those waters out, and can help to say, look, this is exactly what a REN can do for you. Let me make this introduction. Let's talk about a potential collaboration. So I'm going to stop there because I would love to, have some time to talk about this. And I just want to say that we are having our next RCSI, the next iteration of it is in June this year. It's June 3rd through 4th. You can go to rcsi.swarthmore.edu to find information about it, to register for the conference. We would love for people to help disseminate information about this and say, hey, this is a thing. We have a bit of residual travel funding from last year, and we're currently working with NSF. We hope to be able to offer a, like a new travel support grant, but we'll see how that plays out. But we are hopeful that we will be able to do that. So I'm going to leave it there. I would love to hear some feedback or to answer questions or just see what kind of discussion we can have.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, raise your hand or type something in chat or unmute.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I see the.
Well, I'll start with something. You made a lot of really good points on those slides, but one that I noticed a lot, or that really kind of struck home with me, was that local facilitation is important. And one thing that we've done at University of Vermont as we've grown is we've kind of ended up with this like layered approach, and I'm kind of and I'm curious as that other people are adopting something like this as well. So not only do we have like the kind of the central research computing folks that like are really close to our cluster and on the hardware and the systems admin, but we're also like developing like another layer that's closer to the researchers that are more the researcher facing, and they aren't really funded campus wide. Like larger grants will employ folks like at 50% time or some FTE to really help them engage with the research computing team. And this has been really helpful, I think, because they can get someone with like some really good domain knowledge, but like that's computationally adept. And it kind of creates that bridge between the research and the research computing that I think is kind of a really hard gap to navigate culturally, right? Like domain scientists speak in one language, research computing folks speak in another one. And so that's really helped us kind of bridge this gap between the concerns of the researchers, which is to get the work done, and sometimes the concern of the research computing folks, which is to do something cool with computing. So anyways, that's just a little comment, and I wonder if you have a response or anyone else has something to say about that.
Kirk's got an interesting point in the chat about what would it take to, let's just call it a co-op of half FTEs pooled together amongst a bunch of smaller institutions.
I I think one of the comments on that, I mean, this, truly this kind of local facilitation, like first of all, FTEs are, of course, as we all know, very challenging to come by. They often take years to propose and to justify and work through and, competing budget requests and, whatever. So they are very hard to come by. However, I think the real challenge that we see, and this is maybe from my own background in anthropology, is that, as we all know, institutions have their own culture. And that extends to cultures of support. It extends to cultures of just the kinds and types and paces of research and the degree to which those are integrated in teaching. And all of that plays out where it is often challenging. I'm not going to say impossible, but it's often challenging to map support workflows and expectations from one institution onto another. It just isn't going to be a great fit. Some places use ticket systems almost exclusively. Some call, some outsource their, help desk. Some people want to walk down a hallway and darken a door and say, "Hey, can you help me with this directly?" And they're very used to face-to-face work. Spreading out facilitation and expertise, that makes that much more challenging. I'm not going to say it's impossible, and I'm not trying to dismiss it out of hand, but there are real challenges with that kind of model. I think Andy had their hand up.
So I was just going to respond to Patrick's
Oh,
comment,
yeah, please.
which is here at Amherst College, uh, we try to bring in support people who have background experience in some domain or another, research experience. And so they understand the research process. And, last time around, one of the requirements that I made sure we had in there was at least a master's degree. And, got a little question from the people over in administrative computing. Why is that necessary? And it's because that's where they're more likely to get domain knowledge and research experience that they can then help them understand what the faculty need when they're doing research computing. So just having the computer science background is not the same as having, research support experience. So we always look for that, and I think that's important to, get that as into any proposals for new staff.
I have a sort of a response to Jason, in that I think since COVID, we learned that Zoom can be a very effective tool for enabling remote capability. And I think one of the challenges is to create that co-op that allows screen sharing and expertise sharing across the space, because it's one of those things that to be able to span all the disciplines and all the tools, I could spend an hour knowing my expertise and my domain that would take somebody else weeks, months, years to gather. So I think one of the challenges is actually indexing and doing the discovery towards those things. And I think back to your point is, well, everybody wants it local. Nowadays, we do have the ability to make that remote local. I think it's making the connections and creating the directory of services and skills. That's the hard part. And then also, cutting out that, well, wait a minute, you were answering a question from some other institution, but I think the benefit is I got 5 answers for my local faculty from 5 other institutions. So by contributing to the co-op, it makes it better. But I think the challenge still is trying to figure out how to organize it.
Yeah, I agree. And I see Jim has his hand up. I'll just quickly respond there that yes. And one other thing to think about in that is that unless there is sort of a form, like how do you, one added layer of complexity there is if like I'm working for Swarthmore College, let's say, but I have myself in this co-op or whatever, or I'm available, I'm probably always going to prioritize my local institution first. And so when it comes to what are the expectations of support that I'm able to provide to other institutions, that's hard without some sort of formal expectation of that. But yes, I absolutely agree with that. So Jim, please.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
I kind of have a Rube Goldberg microphone situation here.
No, you're
Um,
good.
no, I just wanted to follow up a little bit on what Andy said, because I think he made an important point about the emphasis on a master's degree or some graduate school experience. And that I always found that helpful in when hiring folks, because it was not only that maybe developed more expertise in a field that we were interested in, but they also had that relationship as junior colleagues to faculty members. And I thought that sort of helped with the relationship with getting to know the faculty member and getting to know the type of research that that person does so you can better help them. A lot of the folks that worked for me that, had some college experience or a bachelor's degree, they didn't really have that, and they were very intimidated or put off by faculty members. And I thought a graduate school experience lets you see them as, as sort of colleagues in the process and understand them better.
Yeah, Lauren.
And I'll plus one that because it also matters for how faculty perceive that person for better or worse, right? Like it just is. But the reason I raised my hand to add to Jason's point that, about why local facilitation matters. So yes, there's the point of, I'm probably going to prioritize the folks who are coming down the hallway to my office if I'm embedded at one campus, even if I'm paid 50% to work for another campus. But the other thing is that regardless of being able to do facilitation via Zoom, having somebody who has been to that campus multiple times, if not being physically embedded by having an office, also matters just for understanding things about campus culture. And again, for that immediate trust from the faculty side, right? Like you're one of us, you're part of our institutional mission. And again, for better and worse, it is what it is.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's, I heard a report from one state flagship, land grant institution who had a project where they were trying to kind of solve this problem for some of the smaller institutions, like especially the community colleges, the, non-R1s throughout the state. And they very readily said that our project did not succeed, even though we really, did offer to help support those other institutions simply because there was no local facilitation. Like the faculty and researchers at the institutions had plenty of compute. We were making it available to them. It was not a matter of having infrastructure available. It was ultimately fizzled out because they said, we want somebody local to help us, who knows us. This is to your point, who is one of us, who is embedded within our culture. We don't want to phone the big institution, 3 hours down the street. We definitely want it local. I don't know how to solve that problem. I haven't talked to anybody who has a really good handle on that. Maybe it just will require, as a couple of you have, pointed out, that that's just not something that can necessarily happen, and we need to understand how to communicate and change that paradigm of support. But it is really tough.
There could also definitely be local weirdnesses. Again,
Absolutely.
if you're going to say I need this to run on my cluster versus I need it to run on
Yep.
Bridges.
Yep.
Bridges is the same for everybody. Local cluster, very
Exactly.
likely local cluster, and maybe it's open HPC and you can make a couple of assumptions, but don't bet
And
on
if I'm doing support for remote, do I need an account on that cluster? Like, I mean, how, it just starts to become a little bit, like,
on Kirk's thing about having the index of people, the Connect CI backend that sprawls over all kinds of sites that involve cyberinfrastructure.org. Some of that kind of has that in there. I, the degree to which that can be leveraged, I think, is an open question. And turning that sort of a site into, because I mean we have an Ask CI for certain questions, and it's kind of low traffic. The questions are sometimes weird or exceedingly local, and I think there's potential there, but man, I do not know how to shepherd it to get there.
Kirk, I think your point that was just made in chat is true. I'm consistently amazed at the researchers, the students, whoever it is, who are not aware of certain classes of resources, whether it's local even. I know my colleague Andrew Ruther has said, sometimes he's gone to department meetings within, certain like STEM units and, other departments as well for 2 or 3 or 4 years. And people still are like, oh, wait a minute, we have this. And he's like, yes, I told you this last year, and but certainly for things like access, they don't know what's available out there. Access itself, and they will often admit this when I talk to people who are kind of in various leadership roles within access, that access itself needs to improve. How it presents, like if you have a question related to, well, what resource should I use for this workflow or to do this kind of job? Like it's not always easy to find an answer to that question. Last I heard, there's about 5 different decision support tools for how to find out where to run your job on access, and they may not all give you the same answer. So, yeah, I think that there's some room for improvement for communication, outreach, evangelism, that kind of stuff for both local and extra local resources.
Yeah, and even the number of people, because a bunch of us were at the NAIR pilot meeting last week, the number of people who got communication about NAIR that had zero idea that access even existed, never mind might have been a better fit for some of the things they wanted to do or more expedient or all of the above, was shocking to me, but also not shocking to the access people because they already knew that a lot of people didn't know that they existed.
Well, for my part, again, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for coming and listening to this. And again, rcsi.swarthmore.edu. Please consider attending our conference in June. We look forward to seeing as many disparate voices as we can there, because that's really our belief, is that these kinds of discussions and the community element is really what's needed to tackle these issues.
Sounds great. Well, if there's no further questions, we're pretty much at the hour. So thanks, Jason, for your talk, and we'll see you all next month. We'll be talking about, we'll have a discussion about some affinity groups we're trying to spin up, like kind of informal conversations amongst peers that we'd like to get your input back on how we might construct this this kind of new initiative. So hope to see you there. Have a good week. See you all
Thanks.
soon.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.